Hey everyone, it's Lizzie from Conflict Management. This is a presentation for my final project. I decided to do a manual for the Salvation Army, the organization I work for, but instead of doing it for everyone or for all the staff, I try to focus solely on volunteers. So within our organization, we have, thousands of volunteers. And most of them go through more of like a one-on-one process instead of a overall training. And we've mixed it up over the past few years. And honestly, are still trying to figure out the best way to do it. So it's constantly adapting. Typically, when we sit down with someone, we talk about the different opportunities, what they're interested in, and then kind of go from there. We go over the application process, but there's nothing really tangible that they can take with them. So ideally, we'd probably love to get to the handbook and have that for volunteers, but I thought this could be a really cool aspect of that. So kind of a conflict management handbook, or this would be a section within that. However, there's never really a situation where volunteers would solely handle conflict by themselves. There's always someone there, a staff member of some sort, a case manager, a kitchen employee, whoever's directing an event. So it's very seldom that they would find themselves in that kind of situation. So it kind of took a slightly different spin on it and thought maybe this could be also kind of a prevention in conflict management manual. So this idea that if you're making volunteers aware of people's backgrounds and how they interact with one another and what that communication can do, it would kind of create an atmosphere of better understanding and therefore better communication and thus reducing conflict management or conflict in general. So I started off with just a general mission statement of the organization. I didn't want to assume that they knew everything or anything. Again, this would be for brand new volunteers. So to start off with, we kind of show that we're grateful for them volunteering, and then we list our different programs. In addition to that, we kind of give a couple of stats. They gave 55,000 hours in 2013, they being volunteers. And we kind of wanted to describe what as a volunteer you could expect. You can expect to be treated just like staff, except that you're not being paid, and that you'll be treated fairly and equally. And at the same time, we kind of explain that we rely on volunteers for the supporting of all of our programs, and that we hope that they would then recruit other volunteers. So kind of laying out expectations for both parties. Again, by establishing that, you're kind of setting a foundation. And so there hopefully won't be misunderstandings later down the road. So with that, we kind of explain the purpose of the manual. Again, what I mentioned before is sort of a prevention or awareness, and then also what to do maybe in a situation where there is conflict. And then we list out what you can find throughout the manual. So I have a couple of different categories. We have communication and conflict styles, cultural differences in relation to trauma, identity and face saving, mediation and dispute system design. And then we have a couple of things that are probably more specific to Salvation Army. We have kind of a code of ethics for volunteers and a code of conduct, and then some general do's and don'ts specifically with working with kids. And then additional information about homelessness. And again, it's all from kind of that idea of better understanding of cultural differences, and also to prevent conflict. So, so as we go through it, we'll start with communication and conflict styles. So we just introduced what conflict was to begin with. So we referenced Folger, Poole, and Stutman. To define conflict as the interaction of interdependent people who perceive incompatibility and the possibility of interference from others as a result of this incompatibility. So that's a little complicated maybe for some volunteers, so we try to break it down. This is very much a conversational piece, so I try to use references but not to get overwhelmingly academic because we have a very wide range of volunteers. So I kind of gave an example of what that might look like. So it could be that, there's, as a volunteer, you're seeing a client push back about a particular program. And then we talk about maybe the conflict is often rooted in communication. So we talk about why communication is important and how that can shape our interactions. And maybe, in certain settings, you may talk to your friend one way, you would talk to your boss differently. So maybe kind of kind of setting up that environment and what it should look like in this type of setting. So then we talked about threading from communication into conflict management styles. So we laid it out almost word for word. So went about competing style, accommodating style, avoiding, collaborating, compromising, and even inserted one of the charts from Dr. Jameson's PowerPoints, because I thought that was a really easy way for people to understand if you're avoiding, you do assertiveness or cooperation, or just depending on where you are on the scale. So that visual I thought was really helpful. Then we went into, well, let's look at this from an example. And this was for a volunteer that was just starting out in the soup line. He was really excited. The staff member showed him what to do, and then a group who appeared to have been there lots of times and were regulars kind of started shoving him out of the way. Her out of the way. And so we said, here are some responses that you may have come up with. And then they read through the 5 responses. Which one did you pick? And on the next page it has which conflict style that was. So the idea is that maybe not only seeing, them realizing what they typically ascribe to, but they can see the differences between those. Again, to bridge it about more understanding, we thought that maybe we could flip the scenario, kind of ask them to do that and think about it. Well, what if you were the other people? How would you react? Would have been a different conflict style? So by being aware of these conflict styles, we thought could be really helpful throughout the differentiation process when it comes to conflict, and explain that none of these are necessarily inherently good or inherently bad, just that we typically all tend to ascribe to one, so that if we're aware of that, we can maybe adjust our communication patterns a bit. So then we go into cultural differences, and I think that this is a really important concept with the demographic of people that we work with. We work with a variety of people, but oftentimes, or all the people that we serve are in need in some sort of capacity. So that, for a lot of people, is a cultural difference, whether it's poverty, whether it's homelessness, trauma. There's so many different things that a lot of our volunteers and staff, that's a cultural leap or a cultural difference. We may not have experienced that same thing. So by being aware of that cultural difference and appreciating it, acknowledging it, and then adapting our behavior to be more supportive is really something that we strive to do. So we really talk about that in depth. We define culture. Culture is being used in a variety of different ways, but then we kind of narrow it down to this idea of more so the clientele that we're serving. And we tie it back to communication styles, so that a lot of your cultural differences, or your culture in general, you have developed, in your interactions, you've developed certain communication styles or social constructs, and so that determines maybe how you interact with people, how you see the world. And so trying to make volunteers maybe aware of some of their own social constructs and maybe how they approach certain situations, and then vice versa, trying to make them aware of cultural differences between them and clients, so that there's an appreciation or an understanding. Because a lot of times what ends up happening, or stereotypes maybe come in, particularly harsh ones, and we tend to, on this manual, we're focusing more on the aspect of homelessness. So we give a fairly lengthy example. One of a gentleman, a volunteer that had been in the soup line for, he had been volunteered with us for a while, but was volunteering in the soup line. He really loved to joke, and so the volunteer got him up in there, and it actually did not work out very well, because one of the staff members came to the volunteer coordinator and said, "Hey, this volunteer actually almost caused a confrontation or an altercation in the soup line with one of the clients." And so what it came down to is that this volunteer was joking and was laughing, but his sense of humor was completely different than that particular client. It was very dry, a little bit sarcastic. So the client was not used to that and thought that the volunteer was making fun of him or challenging him. And so that then goes into he's challenging his identity and not allowing him to save face. Sorry, my roommate's dog is whining. So that can be fairly difficult. So we kind of go through that and make the volunteer aware of, maybe that's not always the best situation, as we have differences and different appreciations, and the clients might not always have that luxury or capacity to recognize that cultural difference. So it's kind of up to the volunteer and the staff to set an atmosphere in which those are recognized, and then we adapt accordingly. Touching on cultural differences, we go into more of a trauma, and without getting into huge detail, we taking that whole culture concept that trauma is a common denominator for almost all of our clients. Again, whether it's poverty, homelessness, a traumatic event, or domestic abuse, there's nearly all of them have experienced some sort of trauma in their life. And so we try to create a culture within the Salvation Army and a climate that accommodates trauma. And so we call that using a trauma lens. So we give, again, situations of maybe what trauma looks like, and we specifically go into one regarding clients in the shelter, and as a volunteer, what that might look like. A mom reacts from a change of plans very drastically and dramatically, and you think that she's upset with her, but it's not anything to do with you. It's because of her trauma that she now views change in violations of expectation very differently than maybe most people, and doesn't always handle it the same way. And then I also wanted to list out maybe what exactly does that mean as far as using a trauma lens. So different examples. So problems or symptoms are separate and discrete. That's maybe a traditional viewpoint, but through a trauma lens, you may see that as problems and symptoms are interrelated response or coping mechanisms to trauma. So again, that mom that lashed out to the change of plans, later down the road acts out again. Those aren't necessarily separate actions. It's all this like tied in thing dealing with their past trauma. Let's see. So then we talked about identity and face saving a bit, and just went into that a little bit more, and what does that look like, and what does it mean, and tried to tie that in by the idea of autonomy and connectedness. So I used an example about a volunteer who worked in the office and felt very connected and very appreciated and was really excited, and tried out an event working one-on-one with clients. And the difference between the interaction with the staff and the volunteer and the interaction with the volunteer and the clients was that the first couple were very autonomy focused. They didn't want to be connected to that person, that volunteer. They found it extremely overwhelming, so they withdrew, and because of that, it challenged that volunteer's identity, and that she wasn't sure. There's a bit of loss of face, but because she allowed that client to disengage, she allowed them to maintain their face. And later down the road, found a client that she connected with, and her identity was restored. So then we go into mediation, and with this, I didn't want to go into depth because, again, there should never be a situation where a volunteer is completely on their own. So we talked a little bit about the steps in mediation, just in the case that they would ever have to do that. Again, not likely, but more also that if they were ever involved with a dispute, that they would know the steps, like the process in which we would take. So bringing in a third party, this is what the mediator would do. These are the steps that we would take. This is possibly who would be a third party, and so on. So part of the dispute system design is that I wanted to list out the in the case, like cases or scenarios that would ever cause for an issue with a volunteer, like specifically outside of maybe an interaction. So we listed out causes for a dismissal, expectations about harassment, even dress code, and then laid out the ethics that you shouldn't exchange personal information with people, that you shouldn't do special favors for a particular volunteer, a particular client, all of those things. Again, because you want to create an atmosphere of neutrality. So, and again, trying to add to that, the idea of cultural differences and recognizing them, we gave a little bit more information regarding homelessness and the factors that come into that and the different traumas they go through. So homelessness, it's not just because someone doesn't want to work or they're not they're not trying. There are so many other factors that go into it that aren't readily available to the surface or the eye. Mental illness, domestic violence, learning or cognitive disabilities, substance abuse. The list just goes on and on. So again, trying to put into a mindset that volunteers are part of the staff and that they are to be respected and to respect others, but also a way for them to really contribute to a better a better climate for the clients, is that they take on a better understanding of both their communication styles, their social constructs, and then acknowledging the cultural differences, but not to the point where they ostracize, but they readily adapt and are able then to truly help. So, all right, that's it. Thanks.